Here is the easiest way to use it. Set Color Science to DaVinci YRGB Color Managed. Uncheck Automatic Color Management. Choose HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Set the output color space according to your display device. Since I'm targeting YouTube now, it makes sense to choose Rec 709 Gamma 2.2. Forward OTF will be automatically enabled behind the scenes. Now, let's set the input color space for the clip. In this case, it's ARRI log C3. The source footage is converted from ARRI log C3 to the timeline color space, which is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Then the image passes through all the nodes, from the first node to the last timeline node. After that, it's rendered using DaVinci DRT to Rec 709 Gamma 2.2 display. Now we just apply the DCTL to a node. Here's before and after. Now let's set it up with manual color management. Set Color Science to DaVinci YRGB and Timeline Color Space to DaVinci Intermediate. I'm setting the output to Rec 709 Gamma 2.2. Since I'm on Windows, it only affects the chromaticity diagram and export tags, which I change manually on the export page anyway. If you're on a Mac or on Windows 24H2 and use CleanFeed, no advice for you here. Good luck dealing with ICC profiles. Here, I'm adding a color space transform effect to convert the image from Alexa to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Then, after the DCTL, we add DaVinci DRT. There's a small difference compared to DaVinci YRGB Color Managed. When it transforms from the source, by default, it tone maps or unrolls highlights up to 4,000 nits before converting from the hidden linear stage to DaVinci Intermediate log. And at the DRT stage, when it tone maps to the display, it clips everything above 4,000 nits. In contrast, with the manual setup, I decided not to mess up the source highlights and to preserve up to 10,000 nits at the DRT stage. By the way, that's why I added tone mapping to 4,000 nits by default, to counteract the behavior of DaVinci Color Management. But even if you don't use it, it won't cause any problems with manual color management. Also, keep in mind that this isn't a replacement for the DRT's own tone mapping. Okay, here's the mix of the Filmic palette. Here's saturation. If you lower it enough, you'll see the effect of changing the RGB luma weights. It's also possible to make the desaturation look more natural. I'll show you later when it can be useful. Now let's see how the same parameters behave without DRT. Let's examine the curves now. Here's the intensity of the curves. And here's the mix between two types of curves. You can see the difference on the cheek and in the highlights. The curves are subtle. The goal was to make even crazy random settings look at least somewhat acceptable. And here's the contrast slider, by the way. Here's the curves without DRT. And here's the contrast. Now, here's how post-white balance behaves. It never adds, it always subtracts to avoid any clipping in the highlights. We can also add tint into the highlights. And choose the hue of the tint. Here we can adjust the shadow's tint. It works as naturally as possible. By default, the tint hue is set to teal. For a more retro look, you can change it to red or reddish magenta. In that case, I would also add a cyanish tint to the highlight. And if it's not for a feature film, but for a music video or commercial, you can safely lift the black point by offsetting the shadows. Here are a few gradients based on Rec. 709 Red, encoded as DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. With DaVinci DRT turned on, they all, including the shadows, just look red, which is expected and normal. Now, if I turn on the DCTL, we can see how the darkest reds shift toward orange. I really like this and find it very filmic. Here you can see how the path from low to normal brightness skews toward orange. And here's the same thing on real footage. Here's one way to use post-white balance. Combine it with higher saturation and push neutral colors toward the cooler zone. Now let's make something less vibrant. First, make it a little sepia by white balancing towards warmer colors and reducing saturation. Also, we don't need that much curves here. Now, let's complement our sepia look by adding a bit of teal tint to the black point. Or maybe something extremely saturated with low contrast. Saturation to the maximum. Set contrast to minimum. Turn the curves all the way down. Looks a bit over the top. Let's reduce the Filmic palette. Also, let's lift the shadows to further lower the contrast. Now, let's boost the saturation again, but compensate it by white balancing the image towards cooler colors. To make it a bit more filmic, let's lift the shadows again. And add some warmth to the black point, emulating the common side effect of using offset for color balance in camera log. It tends to over-adjust the shadows, but because it's so common, it's usually perceived as part of the filmic look. Why did I add post-white balance instead of pre? To demonstrate, let's set saturation to the maximum. Now I tint the image after the Filmic palette first. And now I place this correction before the palette. Notice how the skin tones lose density. This happens because tinting towards cooler colors pulls skin tones closer to neutral, where the darkening effect is less pronounced. Of course, nothing stops you from exploring this push-pull in all directions. Tint it orange before the palette and pull it back to neutral after, or vice versa. Now here's a quick demo of how it handles transitions from red to blue. And from magenta to cyan. But since it's intended to be used with DaVinci DRT, you should be aware of some limitations. Looks like clipping in the blue colors. But is it a limitation of the DCTL? No. If I turn off DaVinci DRT, there's no clipping. Now let's turn off the DCTL and try one of the smoothest corrections possible, gain in the linear domain. You can see the same kind of clipping again. The easiest fix is switching DaVinci DRT to JP2499 DRT by Juan Pablo Zambrano. Let's tweak its defaults to something more neutral. Already an improvement. And if you don't let police light blue color, you can adjust the blue channel slightly. Here's one thing I'm most proud of. No matter what crazy stuff I do with the sliders, the look doesn't break into ugly clipping or artifacts. And here's the same crazy random stuff without DRT. Now, desat is natural. What does that mean? I couldn't find real footage to show the artifact, so I rendered this 3D head model. It's lit by red and blue colors at maximum possible saturation in ARRI wide gamut 4 and encoded as DaVinci wide gamut. It's extremely saturated. For comparison, here's real footage with strong blue and red lights. Let's turn on DRT and the DCTL. Now let's dial down the saturation. Here you can see a sharp transition. By default, the saturation slider makes highly saturated colors darker as you reduce saturation. In case of any similar issues, you can change the saturation behavior to act more naturally. It eliminates the artifact, but sometimes you lose visible difference between colors. In that case, you can adjust luma weights and make hue differences represented as brightness differences. And that sharp transition is gone.